Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar on how to do research and get published, focused on research that impacts the queer community. To get us started today, I'd like to introduce you to the team. First, Beth Berry is a senior marketing manager on the research and marketing team at Sage, where she focuses on marketing for the hybrid journals portfolio. As a product marketer, she specializes in content marketing, strategic planning, and relationship management, supporting journal development goals and cross-portfolio initiatives. Passionate about fostering connections, she plays a key role in strengthening relationships within the research community and at Sage, where she previously co-led the LGBTQIA+ Employee Resources Group. Next, Dr. Gavian Sara is a polycultural psychotherapist who holds an advanced accreditation gender, sex, and relationship diversities therapist accreditation with Pink Therapy. He is also a duly accredited clinical supervisor specializing in intersectional anti-oppressive practice, trauma and violence-informed care, and improving practitioner responses to traumatizing violence, abuse, and neglect, including coercive control experiences excluded or misunderstood by Anglocentric cis-het mononormative models of partner abuse. Next, Dr. Hongwei Bao is an associate professor in media studies at the University of Nottingham in the United Kingdom. He is the author of 5 books on queer Chinese history and culture, including his most recent with Sage, Queering the Asian Diaspora. As a poet, he's the author of The Passion of the Rabbit God and Dream of the Orchid Pavilion, both published in 2024. Next, Pascalupo is the Distinguished Professor for Sexual Health and Education at Brown University at Washington University in St. Louis. Paz's longstanding research program centers those most marginalized in the LGBTQ+ community. Prior to joining the Brown School, Paz served as professor of psychology at Towson University and currently serves as editor for the Journal of Bisexuality and the APA journal Psychology of Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity. Paz is also senior author on a recent published publication entitled Sexual Orientation and Gender Diversity Research Manuscript Writing Guide. And last, my name is Sean Skarsbrick, a senior marketing manager on the author marketing team at Sage. My primary role is to provide support to authors and reviewers as they move through the publishing process. And now just to highlight the excellent work of our panelists, we have a few things that they're all working on. I will share this with everybody who is attending, so you'll be able to dive into some of these. Again, a huge thank you to our expert panelists for their expert work. Even though we're joining you virtually, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. We pay our respect to the Wurundjeri people, the Ventureñu Chumash, the Osage, Illiniwek, and the Kikapo people, as well as the American and the Celtic nations. We acknowledge the continued struggles and legacy of colonization, oppression, and marginalization of these people and lands. We honor their enduring connection to the land, waters, and culture, and recognize their contributions to our shared heritage. Throughout today's call, please send us your questions using the Q&A box on your screen. We'll do the best we can to answer as many questions as possible. Just to get us situated today, I'd like to share a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the very early stages of securing funding all the way to the very end where you could potentially resubmit. We have a full slew of webinars on different topics across this, so we do encourage you to go back and watch a recording or join any other webinars in this series. But to get us situated, let's do a quick review of the author process, starting with the first one of conducting research. As a researcher, when you get started, you need to develop your research question and identify your end goal. What is the main point you're trying to do? What is the main thing you're trying to do? Are you hoping to publish a book, a journal article? Are you hoping to impact policy? This is very important to think about early on. You should consider your publication options. At Sage, we have open access options. We have hybrid options depending on your goals and your funders' needs. And it's very important, of course, to secure your funding. When you get started writing, you want to identify the key audience and how you can tailor it to reach them. And you want to make sure that you distinguish your research from other studies, help it stand out. You may work with mentors, colleagues, peers in a number of different capacities. And when it comes time to writing and you want to make sure it looks well, it's well written, we encourage you to utilize paid for services for editing like Sage Author Services if this is something that you might want. When it's time to submit, you want to find the journal that is the right fit. You want to follow your submission guidelines, and this is going to be very critical so that you aren't desk rejected. Importantly, you only submit to one journal at a time. And really, I think it's very important to remain resilient after rejection. Rejection happens for every academic. Don't be discouraged. Just know that, one day, if you continue working at it, it will happen. Then your article or your submission will go through peer review. Remain very open to differing viewpoints and be very patient through the process. You want to make sure that you respond to all reviewer comments. Even if you choose not to go with it, you need to be very clear about why you aren't going forward with that comment. And you have to clarify with the editor if necessary. If you have any questions throughout the process, the editor is the best person to contact. After that, it goes through the top 3 stages sequentially. Your paper may be accepted, it will go through production, and then it will be published. And the last step is separate from these, but really integral. You need to make sure you continue to promote your work. A lot of people, once their article is published, they move on, but we really need to think critically about continued promotion of your work. Remain really confident. Don't shy away from promotion. You want to use outreach through institutional, professional, and personal channels, and contact media and policy sources whenever it is appropriate. And that is a quick timeline of the publishing process, a whistle-stop tour. And with that, I would like to pass it over now into our panel discussion. I'm going to pass it off to Beth to get us started.
Cool. Thank you, Sean. And thank you everyone again for joining today. So I have some questions to keep the discussion going and focused, even though I know we won't get to them all. And we'll see where this discussion takes us, of course. You are all welcome to chime in as you see fit for these questions. And of course, the discussion in general. To kick us off, let's start talking about conducting research. And Hongwei, you're going to start us off. So what ethical challenges come up when researching queer and trans communities?
Thank you very much for the question. This is an important question. There are many ethical concerns. I mean, many institutions require researchers to complete an ethics application form, and answering those questions is simply one small part of the ethics concerns. I think the biggest question with regard to queer and trans research is to consider that those communities have been historically marginalized, have been objectified, vilified, and stigmatized, and even traumatized. How do we conduct research without re-traumatizing those communities, without making use of the communities, or making the community feel that they are treated as objects or as what lab rats, for lack of a better term. I think that a more ethical approach is not to consider them as research objects or research subjects or participants, but as co-producers of knowledge, as collaborators, if you like. So they are generously share research with the researchers, and researchers should give them due respect, not only by asking for their consent for everything, but also respecting them by, sharing findings, and even, acknowledging their contributions in the publication. I've heard many community members complaining that after researchers interviewed them, and then simply the researcher disappeared, and then they had to pay fees to get access to journal articles in which they appear. This is not a good practice. So to treat your researchers, your research participants as partners, as collaborators, and give them due respect. I think this is the most important aspect among all.
Yeah, very well said. I'll give space if Paz or Gavi have anything to add. Otherwise, we can keep going.
I'll wait for Paz first.
Yeah, I think thank you for that, starting that answer off, because I think it is so important to recognize the historical harm that researchers have also perpetuated on our communities. I would also go one step farther in thinking about how can we elevate? So not only can we not do harm, but how can we elevate? How can we ensure that the research that we're doing fairly represents and allows what we know to be true about our communities to be represented in academic literature so that our theories and our conceptualization about queer and trans lives really represents kind of the fullness of our humanity in that way. I'll also just mention really briefly that there are guidelines that have been developed by community members, specifically trans individuals. So there's something called the TRICON policy. So it's transgender informed consent, research informed consent, which allows for additional transparency when engaging participants from within community. That allows kind of establishes more trust rather than just being like, hey, participate, but allowing participants to understand why we're doing the research, who's doing the research in a way that establishes more trust and connection with community. And so I think taking those extra steps are incredibly important.
Mm.
Absolutely. And thinking about that, I'm thinking about one of my own ethics committee experiences when I was doing my research, which was one of my studies was intended to study the empathy gap that people with cis privilege might display when evaluating the magnitude of severity of harm that's caused by misgendering. And the response that I received from the University Ethics Committee actually displayed the very empathy gap I was trying to study by saying that this is not an everyday experience. And they actually put in writing, they said, one of the members of this committee knows a trans person. And so we think that this should be done differently. And then they also misgendered my supervisor, which is ironic because usually I was the one being misgendered. And then they claimed that this was not an everyday experience that people were having. And so I pushed back on that as someone with lived experience. And actually, it turned out that I ended up doing a webinar to educate the ethics committee about the empathy gap and about the misgendering and about the pathologizing they had of trans people. But I think it was a really good example of what Paz was saying, where a lot of times people with lived experience are not consulted on the research. And if they are, there's sham consultation. So when you, just like Hongwei was saying that, when people are engaging with community, how are you doing that? Is that from the very beginning when you're developing the questions? Does that go all the way through to when you're sharing the results? Because if people have to track you down, like you were saying, that's so problematic. But I've noticed that a lot of times people will do these kind of sham consultations, and I've been in some of them. I've even gone to these clinics that were like, okay, everybody from community, what would you like us to study? And the thing is that they already have the funding priorities. They already know what will and won't get funded. So none of the things that get talked about in the space, none of the things that the people with lived experience want and think are important get studied. It's always something they already knew. So it's like a waste of our time, basically. And I think, who determines who the research team members are? If I'm doing a lot of input, why am I not a co-author? Why am I not a co-researcher when I'm doing foundational work? So that's also that kind of predatory approach to community. And then also thinking about which lived experiences, how are you coding your questions? That's an ethics issue people don't consider. So what options do you provide? Who are you considering an outlier, and whose data are lumped into your existing categories, rather than you realizing that there's something wrong with your categories and starting a new wave. And people say, oh, we've already collected some data, we can't make changes. So it's really, if you're in that mindset, rather than saying, let's do a new wave with these changes, you really do have to make sure that you're inclusive. And my experience is a lot of them are very, without realizing how Anglo-centric, how colonialist, how racist, not in a flag waving racist way, but in a people in a racist society will be racist if they're not actively trying to be anti-racist. And it's, the assumption that all trans people are queer, that sort of coercive queering that happens that I've written about in some of my work is really a problem too, because then you're not reaching people who might not identify as trans, who might just be of trans experience, but identify as women or men, might even identify as straight and not as queer. We see this a lot with intersex people where there's a coercive queering happening as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your great points. we're going to dive in a little bit more into bias. Specifically, how is peer review shaped by bias, especially around these topics? I'll open it to anyone who wants to jump in first.
Right. So as far as I see it, peer review often has several dangers. The first one is the majority bias. So essentially, if you come from a kind of majority, heteronormative, and cisgender perspective, then you're likely to think that such a topic, researching on a kind of minority community, is not important. It doesn't speak to the kind of bigger theoretical assumptions or framework that was built on the kind of majority experience. And in this case, I mean, you could devalidate that experience or that theorization. So that's one problem. And the other problem is the use of experience. I think Gavi's example of the ethics committee response actually is a very interesting one. So essentially, devalidating other people's experience on the grounds that you're not familiar with that experience or your experience is different from the other person's experience. I think that's problematic. Rather than celebrating the diversity of experiences, it's problematic to think that all minorities, I mean, all people should have the similar experience. Even if they are in the same community, living in the same city, they might have different experiences. Recognize the diversity of those experiences will be helpful for peer reviewers actually to acknowledge that as long as the research is empirically and solidly conducted with good methodological procedures, even if it diverges from your experience, that's equally valid.
Yeah. And I was actually thinking when you were saying that, there's a real gloss in the literature around community and experience. And I also want to agree with the person in the comments who said living and lived experience, because I think that there's also people using lived experience to refer to a parent of a person. The whole point of lived experience was it's the person who directly has that experience, not all the people around them who want to have an opinion about it. And so, and then there's living experience as well, which the more distal you are from something, the more far away from it, you may not remember. So I have lived experience of being homeless. I don't have living experience of being homeless. And I think that affects things. It's still relevant, but it's not as relevant as it would be if that was my current reality every day. So I think that's a point someone made. But people often talk about members of the trans community. And I feel like that is such a privileged way of phrasing it because there's plenty of people who are trans, who have a trans lived experience. It may or may not be their identity. So when you have research that says trans identity, you're not going to get everyone. But also that you're assuming that people with an experience are automatically part of a community. There's plenty of queer people who are not part of a queer community, and that's actually part of the isolation. And somebody in the chat has said this, and I will say, as someone involved in intersex community and intersex activism, I want to amplify this comment. Someone said, and I don't want to name this person just in case this person wanted to be not named, but this person has said as an intersex scholar that they're facing a recurring challenge that intersex is folded into LGBTQ umbrella as a footnote, not recognized as its own independent experience. There's a question for Sage, which I won't answer, but what I will say is one of the reasons I wrote my book chapter on intersex-centered sex and relationship therapy is because and it happens to be in a book that was designed for primarily queer therapists or people looking at queer therapy, but it was because there was so much coercive queering of intersex experience, so much use of intersex people as trope. And I still see this every day when people send things across my desk to review, that people are lumping intersex people in as a so-called third gender, using intersex people as dehumanized tropes, just basically about us without us. And that's a huge problem. And I see that across the board because there are intersex people who are straight, who are heterosexual. And there's also a lot of research that claims to be queer, but it's very homonormative. So it assumes nobody's kinky, everybody's in monogamous dyads, everybody wants to have children, everybody has a family structure that, equates to the very modern and not very traditional, historically or cross-culturally, nuclear family that's popular, that gets called traditional in this kind of historical revisionist way by right-wing people, particularly in Anglophone context. So I think that when you're talking about what's traditional, most societies in the world do not consider two-person relationships, one woman, one man. That is not traditional. And the family is not just those people and their offspring. And so I think so much of what gets misused in the research is actually people assuming what relationships look like and then imposing this very homonormative approach. So even within queer scholars, they're not actually queer necessarily. That word gets glossed, just like community versus experience. There's queer versus the just like you social respectability crowd. And I think you see that a lot in research. Some people are like, oh, we don't want to show those kinds of people because our research is designed to make us more palatable to the overculture. And that's, Clarissa Pinkola Estes's word, overculture. And I think it's a great concept. The overculture, they're trying to pander to the overculture. So that means a lot of the people that Hongwei was mentioning will be left out and erased intentionally.
The only thing that I want to quickly add to this is from the perspective of being a researcher. I think the other panelists really highlighted the fact that we're working against a culture that really understands us and imposes a lot of other normativities. And so that means as scholars, we have to push back. It means that we are dealing with IRB and we have to often educate. It means that we might get a review that doesn't understand, that wants to impose these normativities on our research or critique us for having a counter narrative. And so it means sometimes you do have to push back against reviewers. It means that you might have to sometimes engage an editor to understand and to point out the bias that's being used against kind of your research. It also means that sometimes we have to really consider the journals that we publish in. So sometimes there's going to be very different practices from research and sometimes not, but sometimes there will be different practices and understandings when you're submitting to a journal that is designed to uplift our communities or uh, um, publish scholarship on our communities versus a more mainstream journal. And so, as scholars and as doing research in this area, we really have to navigate and think about this bias and also position ourselves to resist and educate along the way, which changes how we do research. I also want to point out something that was focused on in the chat is that as that funding piece. Often we don't have funding to begin with. And in the US right now, those of us who had funding, it's all been stripped away. And so the way in which we approach and think about research, the way that we think about funding, what's palatable to be funded is totally different from a perspective of doing research in this area.
You transitioned me so nicely because the next question is around funding. And how does funding influence which topics get researched and who gets to do that research? Kind of already touched on it, but let's dive in further.
Yeah, can I?
Yes,
So I'm probably not the best person to talk about this because my research has mostly been either funded by myself or using my university research leave and internal fundings, which I'm grateful for. For a time, I'm blaming myself. Why did I not get big national funding or international funding? And then I realized actually, so funders have certain priorities. I mean, one of the priority might be national strategic importance. I mean, my queer research, especially my research into Chinese queer history and culture, may not be strategically important for example, for UK government or UK funders, etc. So that's one bias. And the other thing is the kind of social science, in particular, the quantitative bias in terms of funding. So a lot of funders are very, in a way, put a lot of focus on empirical data, in particular statistics. So I think that you have to, I mean, prove that how many people, for example, will have mental health issues, therefore queer need support, etc. So, which is all good, but in a way, actually, only counting people lose so much insight into people's lived experiences. For my research, I'm a qualitative researcher. In a way, I use interpretive methods, and these kind of methods were used analyzed actually in funding bodies and funding schemes, etc. But having said that, actually, in UK universities, at least, I mean, the impact and KE funding, knowledge exchange funding, has facilitated some of the community work. For example, I work with queer communities in the UK to do different workshops, such as Zoom making workshops or drag workshops and filmmaking workshops. And those projects have got funded, and it's great actually to, amplify community voice, to, in a way, to feed limited resources to the community through kind of university channels. So there are different landscapes to navigate. I mean, and different university and different national contexts may have different solutions.
And on this point that was mentioned in the questions, there are completely different priorities in qualitative research than quantitative research, and then in multiple methodologies research. And having done all three, I can say that I think people struggle to pitch their case because when people are trying to make arguments that are designed for very large clinical data sets, that's not the argument that is going to be effective. But certainly someone asked, how do we promote qualitative research? And I think constructs of validity apply to certain types of data. There are many types of validity. There's face validity, construct validity, but depending on the type of validity, there's huge problems with the way that data are analyzed and evaluated. And I think a lot of the funding, certainly here, a lot of the funding comes from HIV and mental health. These are very intrapsychic clinical approaches. So there's always a bias in those types of funding toward asking questions that presuppose that these are internal experiences and let's look at the problem within you. So there's a bias then in that research against understanding what would be important from a trauma and violence informed perspective, which is whatever might be going on within my organism, whether that's cancer or HIV or anything else. There are going to be ways that health issue is not solely intrapsychic, but that it's affected by my access to services, by how I'm treated in services, by my financial position, by my societal capital. And I think when they have that research funding, they try to fit the square peg into a round hole, so to speak. And so I've seen a lot of times where people were trying to research trans community, but they had suicide funding or they had HIV funding. And it was so inappropriate to what community wanted. And it was so inappropriate even for researching that issue because it was completely neglecting the systemic ways that those issues are compounded by that. And so I think, unfortunately, as Hong Wei said, there's with the research, sometimes you're the one that has to fund it. So everything I have that's open access, I had to save up money and do community workshops that then allowed me to pay for example, making those 2 book chapters open access because they otherwise wouldn't be. So then I was able to just share them widely with people, but share them in community. And the problem is that a lot of people aren't even workshopping stuff with people in community and also people with lived and living experience. So what's happening is that people will be interviewed for a study, and then when they see what actually got published, they're like, that is gross, does not reflect what I said or even what I wanted. It's not safe. And there's a lot of twisting of what people said to fit a particular narrative, even if that's well-intentioned for funding purposes. It's undesirable. So one of the common statistics that gets touted repeatedly where I am, and I keep pushing back on, and I have been for now almost about 10 years now, is people say, LGBTQI people have this many times higher suicide rates. Now, when you actually track it back to the actual study, one of the things they found in the studies they looked at was that there were very wide variations because people did not have consistent definitions and because these categories were not consistently recorded by coroners. So when you look at reason for death and people's demographics, there's a lot of gaps. So it was somewhere between roughly the same and 4 times as much. All of they're doing, because for funding purposes, it helps them to say, oh, it's a 60-second soundbite, right? 4 times as much, 4 times as likely. So they keep touting that. The problem is if anyone were, and people do, as many of you know, try to attack your research from a right-wing perspective, from a biased perspective, that completely falls apart. It has many holes in it. The reality is the problem is not we're 4 times as likely. First of all of these groups have different likelihoods. It turns out that non-binary people and bisexual people in some studies had higher risks, than, for example, cis gay men in urban communities who were very linked in. But there were lots of multi-factors involved, including, being part of a racialized group. And so they were very unsophisticatedly quoting these. And this is how people get funding from various organizations like, alphabet soup LGBTQI organizations that are doing that umbrella. And unfortunately, it means that they're on a house of cards because if anyone were to actually fact check that, that is not reliable. The main problem, which they could get funding for, is the fact that nobody knows what the rates are because nobody's cared enough to study. Those aren't priority things to study. So there's not even proper tracking that would allow you to gain those data in a systematic way. And you'll notice some of you who've done meta-analyses will see that there's not even the same definition of things across studies, even not the same definition of what it means to be trans. And you see this where being intersex is itself an umbrella category. Intersex is, over 40 different innate variations of sex characteristics. So which one are you talking about? Because some of them, for example, people with 47XXY sex chromosomes, which are not actually sex chromosomes, that's a misnomer, but people with 47XXY chromosomes actually have very specific learning challenges and very common needs in educational spaces that, for example, people with congenital adrenal hyperplasia don't typically have. And so it's like just being so overgeneralized and not having disaggregated findings means that people are cherry picking statistics to use them and misuse them. Sometimes for good intentions, nonprofits will do this, but that is a very dangerous thing to do. So when you're a researcher, think about who's using your research and do you want it to hold up? And qualitative research can help you figure out what questions to ask in a large scale quantitative study so your statistics will have value and merit. But when you do that, just be aware that those have different aims. Sometimes the qualitative research has to come before the quantitative study if you want your questions to be really in line with people's actual experiences.
Thank you so much. I always learn so much from just listening to you speak. I'm going to jump around a little bit in questions because I feel like this one goes nicely next. So it's a bit of a reflection question. So can you reflect on a time when you had to confront your own bias, privilege, experiences of marginalization in your work, and how do aspects of your identity, such as race, gender, class, societal position, all of those things, influenced your perspective, decision making, and approach to your research or professional practice? And I will leave it open to who would like to jump in first.
I really loved that question when I first read it, and then I really was challenging myself to think of like one good exemplar time, and then I realized that to be a good researcher means that you're doing this all the time. There's not one decision point. It's something that if I'm not thinking about this every day, I'm not a rigorous researcher. I have specific positionalities. I do a lot of research in communities in which I see myself identify and also in sub-communities where I don't. And those are things that I have to think about. Even if I identify within those communities, my experiences, especially having the privilege of being a researcher, an academic, a PI on projects, I have very different power, and I have to know that power in being a researcher, that I'm playing with when I'm thinking about my findings, when I'm thinking about how does that play in conceptually? How does that play in theoretically? I have to think about it when I'm engaging community. I think I'm a really wonderful, approachable person, but that doesn't mean that I don't come with power and that people don't perceive me with power, and with the power to do harm with that. And so as I can be as engaging as I need to be, but I also have to be really transparent. I have to be very clear about my intentions, um,
Mm,
with myself and with my research team. I think that's one place where I really reflect on my biases is as I'm training junior faculty and my students and being vulnerable. I think thinking about your positionality is a practice in being vulnerable, and being open to hearing feedback, but modeling that with my students, which is a hard thing to do because you're in an authority position, but also
mm,
needing to model how are you humble? How can you be culturally humble? How can you be vulnerable in thinking about and constantly processing your identities and your responsibilities as a researcher? So I have a lot of social identities that might fall within queer and trans communities, but I also have a lot of identities. I have an identity as a researcher, which is something that I have to grapple with and understand the power that's associated with that. And as educator and as mentor. And all of those things have shifted. And my understanding of all of those things have shifted across my career. And so I loved the question, but then I was like, if I picked one moment um, in which that I'm thinking about it, I think that I wouldn't be acknowledging all the ways that I need to constantly be thinking of it, and also acknowledging the times that the times that are the most important are probably the times that I'm not challenging myself to engage in them. So I probably don't have a reflection on them because there are times where I failed to reflect on my positionality. So thank you for the
mm.
question. I don't know how helpful that was, but
So I really appreciate past suggested reflections about one's multiple identities as well as the power relations is embedded in. I think that being constantly self-reflexive is an important, quality of being a researcher, and this doesn't have an end. I can give you a concrete example, which is related to my recent book, Queering the Asian Diaspora. The purpose of me writing the book was a result of the marginalization of East and Southeast Asian communities at the beginning of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, though I'm still continuing now, there's a strong wave of anti-Asian racism. People from ESEA, East and Southeast Asian heritage, were very much stigmatized, etc. And there was a rising community activism. I thought it would be great to document historical moment and amplify community voices. So I selected some case studies, some artists, activists, and events, etc., for the book. But as I continued to write the book, I realized my own subject position as a kind of queer Chinese diaspora probably gave me more insight into queer Chinese diasporic cultural productions and activism, but not necessarily to, for example, queer Japanese or queer Korean experiences. Although I have tried to include as many case studies, as diverse case studies as possible, still I feel that there's a long way to go. And also, when we are thinking about, for example, the Asianness and the Asianness is itself a historical and colonial construct. And how do we talk about Asianness and queerness without, for example, recognizing the violence of the kind of historical colonialism and so on? So there are many aspects that I'm trying to grapple with, and I try to cover some of the aspects, but eventually we're not able to cover everything in a small book of 150 pages. So I see this process as a constant process of reflection, constantly discovering the limitations of one's research and trying to overcome that limitation. And this is really like a dialectics of light and shadow. As you see more light, you see actually more shadow hidden behind the light. And then as a researcher, I guess that the most important thing is to be self-reflexive and continue to shed light on more marginalized voices, not only in one book, but also in future work.
I can really relate to that. And I think one of the things it's interesting, I was just about to talk about the variability of bias and the way that people interact with you. And someone's just put a comment about time being time and culturally specific. What's interesting is being a multi-racialized, polycultural person, my experience is very different depending on where I'm going. And sometimes there are places where those are my places, and sometimes people realize that those are my places, sometimes they don't. You see this a lot when people talk about things in broad generalizations. So you mentioned Hong, where you talked about Asian as being the kind of broad over umbrella category, the kind of soupy type way of merging people together who are from many different societies. I mean, just thinking about how many people, how many different racialized groups there are within China. And then just thinking when people think who's Chinese, who looks Chinese, who's real Chinese, that's a Han person. So everybody else, I grew up partly in China. That's part of my background. And yet I'm not Han. So that's completely invisible. But yet when I move through spaces where people are trash talking about Chinese people, it's not that same kind of cost-free experience, but that those racialized microaggressions still touch me, just like certain racialized microaggressions about certain areas that I have family in other parts of the world, they touch me in ways that perhaps the people doing those things may not always realize. And depending on the region I'm in, if I'm doing research, participants will interpret me as being from a different background. There was a time when I was in the US, and I do happen to speak Spanish, but not for this reason. I was in the US and people assumed I was Puerto Rican. Another thing, people assumed I was Mexican. Now, I'm not Mexican, I'm not Boricua, but people were assuming that. Where I am now, people often assume I'm Lebanese, which I'm also not. But they know what white Anglo Australians know is you are not one of us. We don't know what you are, but we like, you don't belong here, get out. And it was interesting because I went to a US-based space on Turtle Island, where people were making assumptions about where I came from, and they were completely off base, but those would be completely different from how I'd be perceived even in the white Anglo-dominated society that I'm living in, on unceded Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nations, so-called Australia. So it's interesting, that point about cultural humility is important because I actually have a positioning reflection, and I don't just talk about those kinds of identity categories, but I talk about the fact that there were parts of my life where I did not have hot water, I did not have reliable electricity, I've been homeless. But right now, I have a toilet that you can sit down on, which is a luxury in many parts of the world. In the village I lived in China, a lot of people had a chamber pot under the bed. They did not have indoor plumbing. And people would call it like a Western style toilet. If you had a toilet you could sit down on. That was a luxury. So I hear people talk about, oh, well, men stand and women sit. And I'm going, there's so much privilege in those assumptions, in terms of just even thinking about how do people engage with basic amenities. There are places in the world, I've worked with people where they did not have access to a toilet at all. They had to travel. And part of the whole reason, in fact, that in France, women's toilets began is actually because there was something called a urinary leash, where all the toilets were only for men, cis men. And so cis women could not travel because there was nowhere you could actually go to the toilet. So you couldn't go that far enough from home that there was nowhere modestly to do that. What's interesting now is in many places, they're sort of creating a urinary leash for trans people where there's no safe toilet. So in a sense, you can't really go anywhere safely. And I think one of the big things for me was recognizing my sighted privilege as a sighted person when I started interacting with blind people and deaf-blind people a lot more, and recognizing also, I mean, I am of deaf experience. I don't have living deaf experience, but I still am influenced by deaf community and deaf pride. But I started to recognize speaking privilege because there are people that don't mouth word, and how often people will use talk and speak interchangeably with communicate. And you see that all over research. But in fact, there are people whose communications are different. So when I was trying to do a focus group, when I had people who had to have text to speech, no one had planned for that, which meant that if two people were talking at the same time or someone typed something, usually if you type something, like right now, when people are typing in the Q&A, it's okay. It's not disrupting, Hongwei or Paz or me. But if you have text to speech on, speech to text to speech, now what's happening is as soon as someone types it, it's being said in this mechanical voice. Now that's disrupting things. So people don't know how to interact in those spaces, which means things are not accessible. And I started to realize that, when people have certain types of checkboxes, actually text to speech does not recognize those. So certain basic features of surveys are not accessible except to sighted people. But you wouldn't know that if you'd never had to do it. I had people who were letting me know that I had to revamp lots of forms for that reason. So those are things people don't really think about. And I think on what Paz and Hongwei have both said, trying to notice things you're not aware of, actively seeking out, what am I not aware of, and constantly checking yourself, not just around what are my identity categories. I think that can become very superficial, but looking at how do I relate to the dominant way things are done, and are they my way? And are there people who the way of going to a toilet is not accommodated, the way of, interfacing with a survey is not accommodated? So thinking about all those things.
Really, really good points, and lots for us to think about and continue to think about. Skipping around in the interest of time, this is a broad question, but how do you safely promote your work now that it's been published or in a book or elsewhere?
No. So I can share you a piece of anecdote actually. So I once wrote a piece about China's LGBTQ community for The Conversation, which is a great forum for scholars to translate their kind of academic work to a general public. So that was great. I mean, the piece was reposted on many forums, including on Yahoo and Google and so on. And then I was appalled actually by the responses because obviously on some forums, some homophobic and transphobic comments actually appeared. And I had never expected that. I mean, living in a kind of ivory tower or bubble of universities, etc. So I would say that first try to figure out what is your goal of communication, which communities you want to reach. It's usually much easier actually to reach out to queer, trans, and queer and trans-friendly communities, even if they're not community organizations, but organizations or platforms that are more trans and queer friendly. For example, now I would hesitate to engage anything with X, but Blue Sky would be something that I'm more comfortable in posting queer and trans events on it. And the second thing is reaching out to communities or to the mainstream media is important, but also be aware that they have their own agenda and it may not necessarily actually be the message that you want to send. I've been interviewed by journalists, and then when the news reports came out, I realized that actually either the quote was taken out of the context or some journalists have misinterpreted my words and so on. So essentially, I mean, choose the forum or platform that you want to engage with, and also be rigorous in checking actually the work, requesting your quote to be sent back to you for approval. I think this is important.
Yeah, I'll jump in only in the sense that I just actually published an article in The Conversation specifically talking about the termination of our grant that was trans focused. So I've been thinking about this a lot. I always thought about promotion of my work, and thought about audience and who do I want to reach, those types of things. And thought about the negative reception. Right now in the US, though, thinking about the larger ramifications in terms of safety, we now have our research lab on lockdown because of because of discriminatory and kind of anonymous threats against our lab. When we published The Conversation, one of the PIs who is not yet tenured was like, I can't do that. I've been told by my university not to speak out. So there's a privilege in being able to do it, but also we have had to also talk about the fact of even if the other PIs are speaking out, can possibly that put the other person at risk. We tried to highlight voices of our research team who lost their jobs, and we had to have conversations with everybody about how comfortable do you want your name to be out there? Because right now in this political climate, talking about this research makes you a target. And we really have to think about that and thinking about how that affects people at different career stages, affects people in terms of tenure, losing their job, but also tenure and promotion and all of those other things. So I don't know that I have any answers, but I do know that this question is so relevant to what's happening specifically in probably everywhere, but I'm thinking about it in terms of what it means about funding, what it means about being a political target for doing this work, and how do we resist it? How do we at the same time ensure our safety, and also how do we speak out and become and and resist kind of these issues. As an editor, I know that recently a number of us came together and kind of had an editorial where we spoke about what's happening and that we're not going to back down. We're not going to not use specific words when we're doing our research, and we're not going to retract research that is about our communities. And so there's ways that we can resist, but as we're doing that, we're always having to weigh our safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to consider the ethics of the work because sometimes it's such an unsafe climate that I think a lot of people focus on the how do I protect myself, but thinking about first and foremost, what's the ethics of to whom is this work accountable? Who did you study and who's relevant to this? And have you engaged with communities about whatever the findings are, how you're going to use them to benefit those communities? And they will have channels and they will have ways of using and promoting them, whether that's in so-called grey lit reports or not. One of the reasons I chose to be an independent scholar rather than go through universities is because I really experienced that kind of silencing that Paz was just talking about. And not so much just in my university, but when I would have research collaborations with people, I noticed how many ethical compromises they were making to try to be palatable, to try to be normative. And I really didn't want that. So I may not have access to large research grants unless I collaborate with people in those spaces, but I'm able to do what I want and really, like Hongwei was talking about, self-funding. Some of the stuff I've done is self-funded. But the other thing is we have a problem here where there's not just doxing, but there's something called swatting, which is where someone will make some kind of anonymous report about something really alarming like terrorism, child abuse, sexual abuse, whatever. And then they will tip people off and they'll give them your address. And then suddenly those people, just because they're trans and they're scholars and they're public figures who've talked about some issue, they will then have like a SWAT team descend with, serious weaponry on their home. And so, for example, I'm very cautious. Very few people know where I live. And that's what you deal with in reality. And I think, I read a really interesting article. A lot of people have talked about the kind of be yourself hope narratives as being incredibly privileged and incredibly offensive. So I think when people say be yourself and be open, I think that is such an incredibly privileged position. There are communities where I can't be open, and I do work with a number of people around the world. So I have some relationships with, and I'm not going to say where for reasons I'm sure everyone can guess, but I have relationships with some scholars in Pakistan. And occasionally they've said, hey, would you talk to my students? Or hey, would you do this thing? And I've always said, yes, I can. But can we talk about the politics of me doing that and what would be safe for you? And so often it's, well, you can say this in this way, but not this other way. I actually taught what, to my knowledge, is the first full-length, full semester course in a master's level clinical psychology program in Poland that was specifically about LGBTQI plus and marginalized gender body, kinship and sexuality, lived experiences psychology, which was LGBTQI plus because that's what people were familiar with, and then GBKS, which was gender body, kinship and sexuality that didn't privilege certain identities from colonizing language. But one of the things about that course was it was the first time in over 10 years of teaching at this place, I had really obscure books from really obscure publishers that I found because I wanted them in the uni library. But this particular course was the first time I had touched those topics. And it was the first time in over a decade that they were mysteriously not able to get the text for me. And it ended up being that my faculty advisor was the head of the department was so appalled by this, the head of the program, that he actually went and bought it with his own funds. He went and bought the electronic copy. And by that point, it was too late. So we just used journal articles instead and other things. But it's interesting just how much pushback there is, even just trying to educate people on the basics they would need to know to do credible research. So I think there are very real challenges at all possible levels. And I think there are some wonderful funds like the Australia Fund. There are some, lesbian foundations, places that do provide funding. That's so important. And really think about the source of funding and how they might constrain your research, because that people don't often think about that when they're really desperate for funding, but it can really make a difference. And someone that's going to back your safety and have your back in case people try to attack you as well.
All very excellent points. Thank you so much. We're coming up close to time, so I just want to let everyone know there will be a follow-up for some of those outstanding questions and questions we didn't even get into. So be on the lookout for that as well. But in the last 2 minutes, because then I need Sean time to wrap up, I wanted to give space for a brief final thought from any of you. Anything you're working on, anything you want just everyone to know from this discussion, and then we can do more follow-up afterwards.
I have a
Yeah,
quick
I guess.
Oh yeah, after
Go
Hong
ahead,
Wei.
please, Gabby.
No, you go first.
Okay, just a quick message, which is that to consider who will benefit the most for your research. I think for most of the queer trans research, the community is the most important reader or audience. Of course, it's great to get funding. Of course, it's great to be published in journals or books, etc. But eventually, it's a community that you're serving. It's a community that you're working with. Think how your research can benefit them, not only by feeding them with information, the community knowledge they need, but also by, for example, training young researchers, increasing the capacity of community activists, and so on. With this in mind, you will be more motivated in conducting queer and trans research.
Yeah, I think a big part of the colonial mindset is the concept of the great person who does it alone and they're so great, they're a sage on the stage, and that is not realistic. I think you really, really need a community of supportive researchers around you, and it makes all the difference in the world when you have people like Paz, people like Hong Wei in your circle who can support you, who can be there for you for moral support, to deal with the moral injuries, the complexities, the attacks you deal with, the bigoted reviewers who really don't get it and who you need to double down on rather than cave into. And I think that is so important. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is, you'll have a massively different response from a journal that is run by bigoted people, and people know what ones those are. There are journals that are boycotted by the community. You can search for that somewhere online in your various searches online. So I won't say what they are, but Paz probably knows what I'm talking about, because I think Paz was one of the signatories to one of the ones I was also, and maybe Hong Wei was as well. But there are journals that we boycott because they say things that are messed up about our communities. So really think about which journals, who's on the editorial board. Find out those people's online profiles. Do they have lived experience? Do they talk in problematic ways? Are they part of right-wing think tanks? Really think about that, because that will affect your experience of the review process and you can get really demoralized. So really look at a journal that's going to be supportive to you. I'll say psychology and sexuality is one that a lot of people have good experiences with, because there's a reason to try to have reviewers with lived experience in the issue you're talking about. Whereas some journals, you'll get all reviewers that they're like, yes, I've published 20 things in this field, but they don't actually listen to the people with the lived experience. They just think that they know, and then they'll discount what you have to say. So if you're getting demoralized, if you're being treated badly, talk to people you know, have a community of practice. Sometimes they can recommend a journal that's going to give you a fair but not bigoted and harsh review experience.
Yeah, I think the point of thinking about us as a community of researchers, I even think about my journal as being an extension in some ways of community. And so use that network. Email editors, email people on the board, um, and really engage in that. So I think you're going to have the most success publishing if you do a little bit of research about the journal. Don't submit something if you're not really citing the work that's already been cited in that journal. You have to know kind of the culture of that journal. If you don't know who anybody on the editorial board is, you're probably not engaging with the scholarship that's being done there. And so do a little bit of research. Also realize that engagement with editorial board members and editors will give you a lot of information, and those that are worth interacting with will want to interact with you back and support you and your work as you move along. So
And I have a last minute promotion. So the Sage Social Science for Social Justice book series is great. The editors are people of color, and we are really enthusiastic and dedicated to supporting authors from marginalized backgrounds. And of course, apart from my book, there are lots of interesting books on the series. So please do check them out. And the editors are very supportive and helpful. So if you have any ideas, contact them and pitch your book.
Thank you, Hongwei. And thank you to everybody for speaking today. I hate to be the one to wrap up this conversation because it's been so great, but um, we do need to pivot slightly just to say at Sage, we have a ton of resources to support you as an author, as a researcher. So check it out. Look to see if there's anything there that will be useful to you. Guides on how to get published, how to promote your resources, all of that. This webinar today was just one of a larger series. So we encourage you to join any of the ones we've got on the screen here, or anything that might be relevant to you. We have a huge backlog of old webinars as well to catch up on. Our next one will be on understanding article and journal level metrics, and then we've got a bunch planned for the rest of the year. With that, I'd like to wrap it up. I'd like to first thank Beth for leading our Q&A, and of course, a huge thank you to each of our panelists, to Hongwei, Paz, and Gavi. Each of you brought tremendous insights to this very important topic, and we really appreciate all of you. And of course, a huge thank you to everybody who is attending today and who will be eventually watching this recording. We thank you very much and hope to see you in a future webinar. But in the meantime, please take care.